Part 1. Intro to Digital and Film Cinematography. Before discussing the ultimate competition of film versus digital, it is important to talk about the history behind both forms of cinematography. Peter Marc Roget first discovered the concept of moving pictures in the 1800s. He realized that our brains retain an image for 1/5 of a second after you see it. So if you put another image before then, it tricks your brain into thinking that it is moving. The first kind of photography was in the late 1600s with the camera obscura. This was a method of taking photos that would use light coming in from a lens to imprint an image on a wall or other medium. In 1872, Leland Stanford made a bet that a horse raises all 4 feet while running. To test this experiment, they set up 12 cameras and had a horse run past to trigger each of them to take a photo. This is known as the first ever video, and in case you were wondering, horses do lift all feet. In 1935, the Bolex H16 became one of the first commercially available video cameras. Shooting on 16mm film, this was Steven Spielberg's choice of camera for years. Years later, in 1995, the Ricoh RDC-1 became the first digital camera to also take videos. The late 90s to the early 2000s were the beginnings of digital cinematography. Since then, there have been many digital cameras that have become industry standard, like the Panasonic HC-X1, Sony PXW-Z90V, and Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. You may be wondering, what is digital cinematography? According to Studio Binder, digital cinematography is the technique of photographing motion pictures as digital images. This style became especially popular in the early 2000s with filmmakers like George Lucas, Robert Rodriguez, and James Cameron. Since notable films that were shot digitally include Dune, Avatar, Hugo, and Skyfall, the leading digital cinema brands include Sony, Red, and Arri, with some smaller companies like Canon and Blackmagic. Digital cameras use a digital sensor that captures the light being distorted by the lens and converts it into data. Digital sensors use millions of tiny photosites, which uncover to collect photons and store these as electrical signals. The camera assesses how many photons fell into each of these cavities by measuring the strength of each signal. There are filters over each of those photosites that only let certain colors pass through. From there, it is stored on a digital device like an SD card or hard drive for easier access and transportation. Film cameras use a roll of thin, flexible material coated in light-sensitive emulsion that retains an image after it's exposed to light. Once the shutter is open and the film is exposed to the light, it imprints an image onto the strip. The mechanics of film cameras are much simpler than digital cameras. Rather than having a sensor that mathematically creates an image, the film is stored in a chamber called the forward magazine, and gears grab the sprocket holes on the film to pull it into position. The film is then pulled into the rear chamber, which is another pitch black chamber that holds the film. The most common film sizes are 8, 16, 35, and 70 millimeters in length, and each size requires a different type of camera. The industry's leading film camera companies include Arri and Panavision, with some smaller companies like Adden and MovieCam. Part 2. Visuals. With film cinematography, the filmmakers can control the look of the product a lot more. There are also so many different ways you can manipulate an image with film that you just can't in digital. First off, film grain is a very sought-after look for many directors and DPs. Each type of film has a different amount of film grain, depending on its ISO. Film also offers unusual sharpness and highlights. Because of this softer texture, it makes the end result more realistic and more similar to capturing real moments in time. There are many more differences when it comes to choosing film stocks, but these are the most popular. You may be asking yourself, what is the reason you would want to make all of these changes? What is it about film that makes directors want these things? Well, all of these things work in unison to create the right aesthetic to provoke certain feelings from the audience. A. Nostalgia. Since film is literally an older form of video, we associate it automatically with nostalgia. B. Reality or memories. Most movies shot digitally have a clean, perfect, and untouched look, but part of the charm of going analog is the imperfections. Our brains are used to seeing real life, where things aren't always pristine and perfect, so the imperfections, i.e. grain, dust, light leaks, and discoloration, paired with great acting, trick our brains into thinking that this is something real. Olivier Zaw, editor-in-chief of Purple magazine, says, "Film gives you less information, but it's emotional information. And what do we care about, information or emotion? We care for the emotion. Film is very emotional." All this is to say that film is an emotional medium. It is used to create an emotional bond with the audience, used in movies like Close, Past Lives, and Anatomy of a Fall. Obviously, there are some exceptions to this, where the movie is shot on film because of stylistic elements. This is very common in Wes Anderson's movies, where the decision to shoot on film was merely for aesthetics rather than emotions. These photos were all taken in the same studio, with the same background, lighting, and overall environment. As you can see, each film stock processed the colors differently. The Portra 800 has a very blue background, while the Fuji 400H is a lot more red. You can also look at the shirts, the lipstick, and the eyes. Next, you can compare the way the light is hitting the subject. On the Akhtar, the light on the left side of her face is relatively harsh, but on the Portra 160, the light on her face looks much softer and more natural. Here are some photos from the 2022 French film, Close. These photos show how just shooting on film can make it much more emotional. When it comes to digital cameras, there's not much variation in the way it can look. The digital look is much more clean, pristine, and perfect. This clean look is better suited for things that don't have too much emotion involved, such as Blue Planet 2 and The Avengers. While technology has become very advanced and it is possible to mostly replicate the film look in the color grade, there's nothing like the real deal. Okay, part 3. Making movies is expensive already. Here's a simple outline of some costs included in digital filmmaking. For this example, let's say it takes 35 days of filming. This comparison will only highlight the differences in the two mediums. On top of these costs are the costs of production, such as salaries, lighting and sound equipment, location permits, props and costumes, and camera gear such as tripods and dollies. Renting an Arri Alexa 35 production set is $20,500, which is $4,106 per week. Renting a 35mm lens is $4,445, which is $889 per week. A 1,128GB SD card costs $41. That's a total of $24,986. Although editing systems have gotten extremely advanced, there's no way to replicate the look and feel of shooting on analog film. Let's do the same experiment, but shooting on 35mm film. Renting an Arri Flex 235 35mm camera package costs $12,250, which is $350 per day. Renting an Arri Ultra Prime 50mm t1.9 lens costs $4,725, which is $135 per day. According to numerous calculations, 35mm film, shooting at the typical 24 frames per second with 4 hours of footage, will need 21,600 feet of film. One roll of Kodak Vision 3 500T color negative film costs $327.50 for 400 feet. This means we will need 54 rolls or $17,685. According to Cinelab, a film production and scanning company, for a 2.5K 4perf for all the footage, scanning the film at professional cost will cost $9,180, which is $170 per 400 feet. This is a total of $43,840. Keep in mind, this is the price for a very limited shoot. On most films, there are more than one camera, more than one lens per camera, and when shooting on film, they use more than one film stock. These are also the costs of just things that differ from digital to film, so this does not include things like salaries, lighting and sound, equipment, location permits, props and costumes, and camera gear such as tripods and dollies. After all the calculations, shooting on film is almost double the cost, so choosing film is only really an option if you are willing and able to pay a much higher price. One of the biggest pros to shooting digitally is the amount of footage you are able to get. The digital sensor is converted into signals that are stored digitally on an SD card. These files can be moved, uploaded, and copied very easily, and because these SD cards are reusable and relatively inexpensive, filmmakers can shoot a lot more. This is great because it gives much more room for mistakes and can spark creativity and spontaneity. Digital cameras are also much easier to connect to a monitor. This allows for much easier viewing on the spot, connecting cameras to 4K real-time video monitors, which can help catch mistakes and ensure that you are getting a product you are happy with. Overall, shooting digitally can save time because of real-time viewing and the use of SD cards, and saves money because there is no need for tons of film and the costs that go along with it. One of the biggest things that makes shooting on film more difficult is handling the film rolls. A 400-foot 35mm magazine shooting 4 perf can only shoot 4.5 minutes of footage. This also can be seen as a good thing, because it can't roll for as long. People tend to be more deliberate when working with film. When people know that their time and resources are more limited, they act with more purpose, therefore saving time in the long run. This is amplified when you add in the fact that film cameras don't connect as well to external monitors, so everyone is forced to rely on the skills of those working on set, since you can't watch a live playback. You also may have a situation like a hair on the lens that you don't realize is there and only see once you have developed and started editing. Another big element of shooting on film to take into consideration is that film cameras tend to be much heavier, so you need to know the plan beforehand, limiting creativity and spontaneity. In conclusion, whether or not to shoot on film is a case-by-case basis. There is never a solid yes or no answer, but in most cases, digital will be easier. There are a couple of things to consider when deciding to shoot on analog film or on digital. First and foremost, you need to look at the price. Shooting on film is very expensive, and you need to have a much bigger budget to allocate to film stocks and developmental costs. In the experiment from earlier, we found that shooting on film can be almost double the price of shooting on digital. If you're working with a client or studio who is willing to spend more money for film, then film may be the answer. After looking at your budget, the second thing to think about is the visuals. Does the film look fit what you're looking for in your shoot? Whether it is a commercial or a feature film, talk to the director to figure out what mood you want to convey to your audience. If film can help you achieve the mood, it may be right for you. The final thing to think about when considering analog cinematography is the practicality. How many days do you have to shoot? To edit? How many people are on your crew? These are the types of questions you should ask yourself about your production. If you have the time and people to work with film, it may be best to. At the end of the day, both options have plenty of pros and cons, and ultimately, the choice just comes down to the creative team and what they are looking for.